In Hour 24, I go back to a passage that we studied already in Hour 23, but this time I'm focusing on the word Sōzein, which means on the surface to save somebody from danger, but which also means underneath the surface to save somebody from death by way of resurrection. So something very mystical, something that really taps into the world of heroes. And right off the bat, in this first text that we're looking at, which is a closer look at the same text in an earlier context, we see that in Athenian mythology, Theseus, who is considered the founding father of Athens in the historical period represented by Socrates, Theseus is saved, achieves salvation by escaping from death when he's in the labyrinth, and after he has killed the Minotaur and he has to make a getaway from the labyrinth and go out of the labyrinth. And that salvation in myth is then reenacted in the sacred voyage of the ship that sails from Athens to Delos and from Delos back to Athens, a sacred time in the cycle of the Athenian calendar that must not be polluted, and that's why Socrates cannot be executed during that time frame. And what is Socrates doing? As I've noted already, Socrates during that time is engaged in theoria, that is to say, in dialogue, talking about these larger-than-life things that you and I call theorizing in philosophy. So text A is, again, one of those situations where you can see how precise Plato's own wording is, and what a beautiful exercise in recapitulating the basic truths about ancient Greek heroes is going on here. Plato, at any given moment, will give myth a second chance. Although you could say that in Plato's works, especially in the Republic, there's this quarrel between myth representing poetry and song, and then philosophy representing rational thinking. And even if most of the time it seems as if Plato's Socrates wants to ban myth, and certainly ban myth from the ideal state, which is being shaped in Plato's Republic. Nevertheless, by the time you get to the end of the Republic, you see that there are openings. And it's almost as if Plato's Socrates were leaving the back door open to allow myth to sneak back in, provided that myth observes the rules of philosophy. And you could argue that that's what the myth of which is the way Plato's Republic ends, is all about. It's a myth that serves the philosophical agenda of Plato's Socrates, and more generally, Plato himself. And here it is in text B, Socrates, Plato's Socrates says, and so Glaucon, myth was saved, mythos esothe, and it could save us in turn if we trust it. Wow, so it's not only that myth achieves salvation, its myth can be the source of our salvation if we use it right. And sure, for Plato's Socrates, the way to use it right is to use it philosophically, but I like to go one step further back and to say that if we understand the importance of myth in ancient Greek song culture, and that's what we've been doing for 24 hours, then we understand that myth is the way to understand the ancient Greek hero. It is the medium of the hero. And so if myth can be saved, then maybe it can save us, and maybe the idea of the hero can save us. And when I say us, of course, I mean people who lived in 399 BCE when Socrates took the hemlock. But in a more general sense, can't we say that the idea of the hero is a source of salvation if we just engage with the words that convey the idea of the hero and convey that idea so accurately, so precisely, so artistically. In this same hour, I try to do a very quick survey of some of the other moments when people are saved in a deeper sense by way of contact with the divine. One really good example in text C, I will not take up much time with this here, is the way the steersman is saved in a ship, which can be seen as the ship of state, saved by Dionysus, who, although he exemplifies how people can be punished if they go overboard, excuse my playing with words, when they are excessive in their behavior. Nevertheless, Dionysus is the god of equilibrium, even though he is so often associated with disequilibrium, but that's because he'll punish disequilibrium. In any case, given that role of Dionysus, the fact that the steersman here is the only person on the ship who is saved, when you think of that ship as the community at large, is a very good illustration of, again, salvation for a prototypical figure, in this case, the steersman of a ship, who is the hero whose role, shall we say, can be a model for how we in our lives can achieve salvation. Then, of course, there's Achilles himself, the first hero we really got to know well through the experience of reading closely the textual evidence about Achilles. And I repeat here from an earlier context in text D how Achilles himself can be described after death as olbios, as somebody who is blessed in the transcendent sense, in the deep sense of having achieved an afterlife that is suited for the cult hero. And when you think of Achilles that way, your mind makes contact with all sorts of images of achieving salvation. One of them is, let's say, the picture of sailors who are about to drown at sea in a shipwreck and who are then miraculously rescued by the light emanating from a solitary lighthouse that flashes its luminous message of salvation to people who are lost. That's what text E is all about. When you look at other texts in the Iliad as text F and others where you can see the status of Achilles as a cult hero, maybe more clearly than in other situations, you start appreciating that, yes, Achilles is primarily an epic hero in our Iliad, but there are so many indications of that other status of his, which is the status of a cult hero who's ready to rescue the just and to punish the unjust. That's the kind of message that we see taking shape in text F. And that kind of message of salvation is something that is definitely still alive and well in the historical period, as we see in text G, where Herodotus weaves into his narrative about the history of the war between the Persians and the Hellenes in 480 and 479, an amazing scene where the armada of the Persian navy is damaged seriously because of a storm that comes from the Hellespont and seems to be sent by none other than Achilles himself and his mother, so that all-powerful goddess and her brooding son, who presides over the Hellespont at that spot that separates Asia Minor from Europe, sends all the way from there at the Hellespont, all the way down to the coast of the European mainland, a wind that is actually called after the Hellespont. What a symbol for the salvation that people can achieve through the intervention of the cult hero, even in historical times. That's the message that we're reading here in text G. So we have to pay very close attention to the symbols, to the visual cues that are sent off by Achilles himself already in the Iliad, which have one meaning for the characters inside the Iliad, but which have an even more important meaning in some ways to those who are listening to the Iliad in historical times. That's what's going on in text H, where the light of Achilles is seen as a message of salvation for those who are in trouble. And similarly in text I, again, the idea of the light that emanates somehow from the hero and that gives a message of luminous salvation for those who are threatened by mortal danger. It's all there, and it is said in so many different ways, but with that same relentless message of hope for coming back to light and life. And what a good time to think about the way a lyric genius like Pindar in the middle of the 5th century can meditate about this kind of luminous light of salvation. That's what you see in text J. And then, if I may switch from Achilles to Odysseus very quickly, in text K, you see a primal scene where Odysseus shows how it is when a hero is saved from darkness and death and can actually make contact with light and life by way of divine intervention. And so here we have a kind of scenario for immortalization after death, played out on a symbolic level at the moment when Odysseus seems to be drowning, but then gets rescued by the white goddess. Let's go all the way back to Plato's Socrates. We examined the philosophical agenda of Plato's Socrates and Plato himself in hours 22 and 23. Here in hour 24, I look at the actual moment when Socrates dies. And it's a beautiful moment. It's made beautiful by the words of Plato. And it's that moment that really tells us that if we think that the word of and by the hero is a salvific thing, is something that gives safety, salvation, let's use the Greek word soteria, then there is no reason to despair because of death, and there's no reason to mourn and to weep uncontrollably, even when somebody like Socrates dies. And this is where I think it's the best place to end, or at least to come full circle, when Socrates says, just before he dies, and these are his last words, "Don't forget to sacrifice a rooster to Asklepios." What he's saying is that when you go to the shrine of Asklepios and you sacrifice a rooster before you go into a state of ritual incubation where you spend the night hoping that Asklepios, the cult hero, will save you, then it's a sign that the rooster crows when you wake up, and that you're woken up by the sound of roosters crowing. So the rooster that was sacrificed the night before is replaced by another rooster that crows the morning after, just as the voice of Socrates is silenced the night before, but then that same voice in continued dialogue keeps living on, so that what's really important is not that the body follow the model of the hero in achieving immortalization after death. It would be nice if that really did happen. Plato's Socrates wants that to happen. But what's even more important is for the word to come back to life each time people engage in dialogue all over again. And as long as the word lives, then the idea of the hero also lives.